The grand ballroom shimmered under the glow of massive crystal chandeliers, their dazzling light casting intricate patterns across the marble floor. Waiters, dressed in immaculate black and white, moved swiftly between tables, their silver trays carrying glasses of the finest champagne. This was no ordinary night. It was one of the most prestigious charity galas of the year. The event had gathered Hollywood's elite billionaire philanthropists and high society figures who had come to flaunt their wealth under the guise of generosity. Women in shimmering gowns, their necks adorned with priceless diamonds, exchanged practiced smiles and calculated glances. Men in custom-tailored suits stood in small groups discussing business deals and investments between sips of aged whiskey. The air was filled with a mixture of expensive perfume, the subtle clink of crystal glasses, and the low hum of carefully measured conversations. But beneath the grandeur, there was an unspoken rule. This was a place where status was everything, and appearances dictated respect. And then she walked in. Sandra Bullock entered the ballroom alone, her presence understated, yet effortlessly graceful. Unlike the other women, she wasn't dripping in diamonds or wrapped in a designer gown meant to outshine the rest. Instead, she wore a simple, elegant gray dress, its beauty lying in its subtlety. There was no entourage, no dramatic entrance, no attention-seeking gestures, just Sandra, moving with quiet confidence. For a brief moment, a few photographers turned their lenses toward her, capturing her poised expression. But just as quickly, they shifted their focus back to the more ostentatious arrivals, the ones who craved the spotlight. As she stepped further into the room, whispers began, the subtle kind, hidden behind raised glasses of champagne and polite smiles. A well-dressed couple exchanged glances, their expressions flickering between curiosity and judgment. A woman in a floor-length gold gown whispered to her companion, "That's Sandra Bullock, right? Why is she dressed like that?" The shift was almost palpable. In this world where extravagance equaled importance, Sandra's unassuming elegance made her invisible. But she didn't care. She hadn't come for the glitz and glamour. She was here to support a cause she deeply cared about, raising funds for at-risk children. The whispers, the glances, the silent judgment, none of it mattered, or at least that's what she thought. Across the ballroom, seated near the main stage, two women watched with amused disdain. Eleanor Cartwright and Vivian St. James were social royalty, wealthy, powerful, and well aware of their place in the hierarchy of high society. They were draped in designer couture, their wrists weighed down by glimmering diamonds, their every movement calculated for maximum elegance. But beneath their carefully maintained facades, they thrived on exclusivity, and that meant ensuring outsiders stayed exactly that, outsiders. Eleanor took a slow sip of her champagne, her painted lips curling into a smirk. "Does she even know what a gala is?" she murmured, tilting her head toward Sandra. Vivian chuckled, her voice dripping with mock sympathy. "Bless her heart," she said. "Some people don't belong in places like this." Eleanor sighed dramatically, swirling her drink. "You'd think she'd at least try to look the part. Honestly, it's embarrassing." Vivian leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "It's not just the dress. Look at her. No entourage, no bodyguards, no effort. It's like she walked in off the street." They both laughed softly, the kind of laughter meant to wound without confrontation. Sandra, standing just a few feet away, heard every word. She could have turned around, could have said something, could have put them in their place. But she didn't. Instead, she simply took a slow sip of her drink and walked away, because she had nothing to prove. But Eleanor and Vivian weren't finished yet. As Sandra moved through the ballroom, she felt it, the weight of their glances. Not ones of admiration or curiosity, but ones of judgment. Here, appearances were currency, and tonight, Sandra wasn't spending enough. She took a deep breath, reminding herself why she was here, to support a cause, not play social games. But just as she was about to take her assigned seat at one of the prominent tables near the stage, a waiter hesitantly approached her. "Excuse me, Miss Bullock," he said, shifting uncomfortably. "Your seating arrangement has been changed." Sandra frowned slightly. "Changed? To where?" The waiter hesitated, then motioned toward the far side of the ballroom, to a table near the back. A table far from the influential guests, far from the stage, far from the people who mattered in this world. For a moment she felt the weight of it. She hadn't just been ignored, she had been deliberately pushed aside. And she knew exactly who was behind it. From across the room, Eleanor and Vivian exchanged smug looks, their amusement barely concealed. This was no accident. Sandra took a slow breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing any sign of defeat. So instead, she simply offered them a small, knowing smile, turned on her heel, and gracefully walked toward her new seat. But inside, she knew. This night was far from over. Because if there was one thing people always forgot, it was that Sandra Bullock was never one to be underestimated, and soon they would all learn that the hard way. Sandra sat at her new table, far from the glittering chandeliers and the powerful guests who dictated the hierarchy of the room. She wasn't bothered by the seat change, nor the cold glances from those who had already decided she wasn't worthy of their attention. But one thing did catch her attention. Eleanor and Vivian were whispering excitedly, their eyes darting toward the stage. Sandra casually lifted her glass, tilting her head slightly to eavesdrop. "Tonight is going to be unforgettable," Vivian murmured, her voice laced with amusement. Eleanor smirked, swirling her champagne. "Oh, I know. Keanu has a surprise planned. I think Sandra will love it." Sandra's fingers tightened around the stem of her glass. Their tone wasn't one of admiration, it was mocking. What were they planning? She had known Keanu for years. He wasn't the type to play social games, but something about the way Eleanor and Vivian spoke made her uneasy. The night was far from over, and she was about to find out why. The chatter in the ballroom quieted as the host took the stage, his polished voice carrying over the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for being here tonight. We are honored to have you support such an incredible cause." A wave of applause swept through the crowd. Sandra watched as the host smiled and turned toward the side of the stage. "And now it is my privilege to introduce the man behind tonight's event, the man whose generosity has helped countless lives. Please welcome Keanu Reeves." The room erupted into applause, the atmosphere shifting instantly. As Keanu walked onto the stage, his presence alone commanded attention. There was no need for grandeur. He had what Eleanor and Vivian lacked: respect. Keanu adjusted the microphone, his expression warm but composed. "First of all, thank you all for being here. This cause is one that's very close to my heart, and I'm grateful to see so many people come together to support it." Sandra observed the expressions in the crowd. Even now, despite his humility, the guests still measured his words against status and power. But Keanu wasn't here for them, and soon they would realize that, because the next words out of his mouth would change everything. Keanu took a deep breath, scanning the audience. Then, with a subtle smile, he said, "Tonight, I want to take a moment to recognize someone special, someone whose generosity has been instrumental to this cause." The crowd shifted in anticipation. Eleanor and Vivian sat up straighter, their smug expressions returning. Keanu continued, "This person has given so much quietly, selflessly, not for status, not for recognition, but because they genuinely care." Sandra suddenly felt every eye in the room on her, but for a different reason this time. Keanu smiled warmly. "That person is Sandra Bullock." Silence. Then, in a slow wave, applause erupted throughout the ballroom. Sandra remained still, absorbing the shift around her. The same guests who had ignored her, who had whispered about her, who had moved their attention elsewhere, were now clapping for her. Eleanor's smile faltered, and Vivian's fingers clenched around her wineglass. They had spent the night trying to humiliate her. And now, Keanu had just made her the most important guest in the room. For the first time that evening, Eleanor and Vivian sat in stunned silence. The power they held, the whispers, the glances, the exclusion, all of it was gone. Sandra didn't have to look at them to know they felt it. The very people who had dismissed her were now lining up to shake her hand. Sandra remained poised, letting the scene play out around her. She wasn't angry. She wasn't vengeful. She simply felt amused. Eleanor took a slow breath, trying to maintain what little dignity she had left. Vivian leaned toward her, whispering, "This can't be happening." But it was, and there was nothing they could do about it. As the event continued, Sandra made her way through the ballroom, her movements unhurried, her confidence effortless. And then she reached Eleanor and Vivian's table. For a brief second she paused. Then, with the slightest tilt of her head, she said, "I hope you enjoyed your dinner." Silence. Eleanor's smile tightened into something that wasn't quite a smile. Vivian's knuckles turned white around her glass. Sandra could see it in their eyes. They had been defeated in front of everyone, and she hadn't even lifted a finger to do it. As Sandra turned to leave, Eleanor forced out, "Sandra, you can't honestly believe that." Sandra stopped, glancing back, and then, with an amused smirk, she said, "If I wanted acceptance from people like you, I would have worn diamonds too, but I didn't." Eleanor flushed, struggling for a response, but Sandra was already walking away, and with every step she knew they would never forget this night. As the event began winding down, Keanu found Sandra standing near the balcony, looking out over the city skyline. He approached her, lifting his glass. "Well played," Sandra chuckled, shaking her head. "I didn't do anything," Keanu smirked. "Exactly." For a moment they stood in comfortable silence. Then Keanu said, "It's funny, isn't it? How people think status and wealth define power." Sandra nodded. "The funny part is, they never realize that power and respect can't be bought, only earned." Keanu raised his glass. "To the ones who understand that." Sandra clinked her glass against his. "And to the ones who never will." As they left the event together, Sandra took one last look at the ballroom, the place where appearances had meant everything, until tonight. If you enjoyed this story of poetic justice, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe. Tell us in the comments, who do you think got the biggest wake-up call tonight? Stay tuned for more powerful stories of karma, redemption, and triumph.